Before we begin, I'll take this moment to thank Knock3 for recording this excellent footage. Here's a shout out, link to their channel in the description. Sorry it's taken me so long to get around to this review, guys. I know you love hearing me talk about Sonic crap, so here's your fix. Let me just advise you guys to watch my review of Sonic 4 Episode 1 beforehand, so you can see how I think this game is an improvement over the first game. Basically, this whole review is going to be a comparison of sorts between the two games, which are indeed different enough for me to consider them two separate entities, unlike Sonic 3K, which was clearly just one game split into two halves. Let's talk about the gameplay. First, let's get the physics out of the way. Look guys, you have to understand that physics are what defines Sonic as its own unique series. Other series have their own unique physics and momentum that may change between games, but the gameplay of those games isn't so utterly dependent on such things as a Sonic game tends to be. Don't you think how Sonic moves, how he reaches those spectacular speeds is kind of, well, important? The thing about a series like Mario is that when they change the physics, it's for the sake of improving the gameplay and making it more intuitive. Mario 3 controlled significantly better than Mario 1, and Mario World controlled better than any game that came before. The new games don't really make any improvements with the physics, but they still play just fine. In the case of Sonic 4 Episode 1, the changes made to the physics don't do anything to add to the gameplay experience, or even maintain it as a good game. If anything, it dissolved what made Sonic special, making Episode 1 inferior to the gameplay of the classics, a downgrade if you will. The physics of the old games made it possible to perform wild stunts extremely acutely, and just the possibility of being able to pull off such things gave the old games a dimension and depth that is yet to be replicated or matched. In Episode 1, there's only so many things you can do that amount to anything more than glitches, making the gameplay that much more restricting. In the case of Episode 2, however, the physics have been improved quite a bit. They're definitely not perfect. The developers still have a long way to go, but at least you get some sense that they kind of tried this time. It's all about baby steps. At least now when you try to roll down a hill, something does happen. As for Super Sonic featuring the physics of Episode 1, I have no idea how that works. It just makes me reluctant to ever play a Super Sonic. Okay, now that this is out of the way, let's talk about the game's other qualities. The level design has its highs and lows. There are a lot of really cool ideas, but some of these are just unforgivably dickish, kind of like in Sonic CD, but more so. You will find more than the typical generic block platforming that gets really stale really fast, and I do want more out of a Sonic game than that. And overall, I do think the level design of this game is superior to that of Episode 1. As for Act 2 of White Park, I know you guys may expect me to despise this stage, but I really don't. If the entire game played this way, then I would be disappointed. But I don't have any beef with occasional stages like Chemical Plant, so why should this particular stage bother me? It's fun for what it is. Still, a lot of problems from the first episode carry over to this one. There are way too many boosters and homing attack chains and spring chains and all that uninspired schwarbage that Dims thinks we can't get enough of. I don't get how it's so hard to understand what makes such things stupid. When you trigger a scripted event, you give up control of the game for a bit. That isn't a big deal to some people, and having a few lightly sprinkled here and there for the sake of visual thrills needed to keep people's attention or whatever, fine. But when you have these things pretty much everywhere, it's that much less of the game that you are actually allowed to play, that you have the privilege to play. Homing attack chains are just... You know what, I've already gone over this too many times in older reviews, let's move on. The biggest dick move of all, a trope that Dimps thinks adds genuine challenge to the overall experience, is their really nasty habit of throwing in a massive bottomless chasm at the end of many levels, which can be extremely nerve-wracking for anyone who's done so well up to that point, only to lose their score because they couldn't make it across these mile-long death pits. But if you're just casually breezing through and don't care about accumulating points, it really isn't that big of a deal. The gimmick that stands out the most this time is undoubtedly the various formations in which Sonic and Tails can use a superpower of teamwork to save the day. You can fly around for a bit, which is finicky and takes some practice, but works reasonably well most of the time, and you can use it to save yourself. The super combo spin dash thingy that's difficult to describe, but mainly used to break into hidden areas. Swimming, which is like flying, but more than a little easier, and all of these moves are pretty useful, and do contribute something innovative to the game. Sorry to say, there are some points in the game where you have to use these moves. It's not quite as cringe-worthy as being forced into a homing attack chain in Episode 1, but it's still forced upon you. For example, you may be inclined to fly across the aforementioned Canyons of Doom with Tails if Sonic isn't able to make it across himself. I'm not really sure if this is something to complain about as far as the gimmick itself, just the implementation. The one thing I really do consider worth complaining about when it comes to the teamwork gimmick is those signs littered throughout the whole game that show you how to use these tricks, when you really would have to be a total tard not to know how to perform these tricks that you certainly must have used at some point by now, or just someone who has such a poor memory that you probably don't even remember how this review began. It's trivial, but it's just so overwhelmingly insulting to the player to find these things at the end of the game. How could they have made it this far if they just never learned how to play the game by this point? Oh, and then there's the special stages. They're the usual typical running down a tube stages we've seen so many times before. But they're okay. There really isn't anything bad I can think of to say about them. In fact, I'd say they're on par with those of Sonic Heroes and Sonic 3D Blast for the Sega Saturn. Anyway, all of my little gripes aside, I do find the gameplay of Episode 2 to be significantly more gratifying and memorable than that of Episode 1. As for the bosses, they are inventive and very memorable, but most of them begin with a stupidly long intro sequence that's really easy to get tired of after your first attempt. This is where the teamwork proves to be the most game-breaking, but that really isn't a detriment to the bosses themselves. I do appreciate the innovation of these bosses. They really do feel like a natural step up from the bosses of the classics, in which we started with lightly equipped, lightly armored junk eggmobiles that got increasingly tough and glam throughout the later classic games. Finally, we have some bosses that can be considered on par with those of S3K, though mainly in terms of design. The Metal Sonic fights are also quite fun. It's also worth mentioning Episode Metal. All I can say about that is, well, it's okay. I really don't have much to say about it, but it is nice that they included an extra little something like that. You see, this is how DLC should be handled. It should be an addition of something new that rewards players for their earlier purchases, not depriving them of content that they should have had long ago, though let me also add that I love that Metal Sonic uses those sound effects from Sonic Adventure 2. Now let's talk about the graphics. The graphics are a huge improvement over the visuals of Episode 1. That game's world felt like sheets of paper sliding over each other, but the worlds of this game have so much more depth. The backgrounds feel so alive and rich. As for rehashing elements from other games, it's not done quite so offensively this time, at least not for most of the game. Sylvania Castle, in some ways, is clearly a mix of Aquatic Ruin and Marble Garden, and even has some elements of Kingdom Valley thrown in there, but it still feels a lot more unique than, say, Splash Hill Zone, and leaves a bigger impact as an opening stage. The trees, the towers, even just the colors. The green and beige and bluish gray go really well together and are so much more pleasant to the eye than the pukey yellow rocks from stages like Aquatic Ruin. White Park is my favorite zone given that the environment keeps changing. Oil Desert is a mixed bag, honestly. There are a lot of little things in it that make it interesting, but the overall vibe gets pretty stale before long. As for Sky Fortress, this is where it all falls apart. They don't even have any original Badniks, which is kinda sad considering there are quite a few original Badniks in the other stages. They just totally gave up on any shred of originality. From the menu, I think the ship's design is pretty cool, and some of the art direction in the zone is nice, but couldn't they at least make it a different color or something? Oh, and Act 1 drags on for way too long. For what it is, the Death Egg 2 is a pretty cool place. I like how the construction of it is completed between the two acts, and the boss fights are quite interesting. Anyhow, I really do like the game's visuals, though mostly in the earlier levels. As for the music, it's a huge mixed bag. Again, I wish we had real music that could reflect the scenery. Just try listening to the special stage music from the Saturn version of Sonic 3D Blast while playing through one of this game's special stages. That bass is simply orgasmic by comparison. Some of these tunes I think are great as far as composition goes. It's the sound that's unbearable sometimes, especially the boss theme. Some tunes are composed so well that they sound good despite the synthesizers used, such as Metal Sonic's theme. There is one other thing that bugs me about the soundtrack though. Throughout Episode 1 and half of Episode 2, each act had its own unique theme. Upon reaching Oil Desert though, they just sort of gave up and remixed the same tunes again and again. Did they just run out of ideas? Oh well. I know I'm kinda nitpicking, but I just felt like pointing it out. Now, for the story. The story is okay, I guess. Nothing really groundbreaking or particularly inspired, though Episode Metal does contribute something to the story and tie it all together better. The ending is what really gets to me. Why end it this way? Anything would be better than this. Couldn't they at least show the Death Egg split in half after all the lights go off, with it floating apart so the little planet is free? Oh well, if we never get an Episode 3, not much has really been lost. Sonic games aren't known for their inspired storytelling in recent years anyway. Anyway, final verdict. All things considered, Episode 2 is a much better game than Episode 1. It's not a great game, but I have to acknowledge the things that do set it apart from Dips's underwhelming previous attempt to recapture that good old Sonic magic. They've still got a long way to go, and if they ever do, by some stretch, make a third episode someday, let's hope that's as much of an improvement over this entry as it is over the first. Personally, I don't care if we get another episode. I've had enough of Sonic 4. I've had enough 2D Sonic. I want something totally grand and new, like a completely 3D game with radical, completely new zones to explore if it can be helped. We'll just see how Sonic Team and, by association, DIMS carry on from here. It's been a while since we heard anything about a new game, and aside from that new racing game that looks pretty cool, we probably aren't getting one for a long time. But I'm okay with that. The dark age of Sonic is over. All of the Sonic games made lately range from competent to awesome, where they used to range from half-decent to unsalvageable messes. The changes made in Episode 2 since Episode 1 are a good sign, and whatever we see next, let's just hope these games continue to improve as they have been. We've come a long way, guys. Way back when I started doing these reviews, the future of Sonic was uncertain, if not downright bleak. Now though, it's getting brighter all the time. Toodles, guys.